welcome to mediatorpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about mediation, negotiation, and collaboration. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm a valuation expert and divorce financial mediator in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm speaking today with Laurie Israel, and she's a national prenuptial agreement mediator, consultant, lawyer, and author of the Generous Prenup, How to Support Your Marriage and Avoid the Pitfalls. She's located in Western Massachusetts and had an office in Boston, has been an attorney for over 35 years. And today we're going to discuss prenups and postnups and who needs them and why. Because, Laurie, I've looked at your book, The Generous Prenup, and you kind of have a different way of looking at prenups and maybe what you believe they would be beneficial for and where they wouldn't. And so maybe you could just tee us up with kind of your bigger philosophy about prenups in general.
Okay. I think that prenups in general are really dangerous for people getting married. There's all sorts of inequalities in power. A woman might want to give up everything because she doesn't want to be looked as a gold digger and give up rights that are really important. A man might do the same if the woman is the more wealthy spouse. The beginning of it is usually horrible, where the wedding invitations are sent and the guest list is there. The save the date maybe will be set. Deposits will be made for the wedding, and one of the spouses said, we need to have a prenup. And it puts people in a very, very bad place in general. There are circumstances where a prenup is really important. There's several fact patterns, we call them. One is second marriages, where the people have children for first marriages and enough money so that they don't need to spend the money just supporting each other, but they can leave money to their children, because most people want to do that. There's the situation where somebody is in an active business or in an active family business, and that really needs to be thought about and figured out how that's going to work within the marital financial relationship. And then there are people that have accumulated a lot of premarital assets because people are getting married later, and that needs to be thought about, and often that is a good reason for a prenup. There's people that have been in really bad, awful divorces, and they don't want that to happen, and that could be remedied basically in a prenup by having alternative dispute resolution terms. People with very rich parents that have an inheritance potential that is really high. People whose parents say you have to have a prenup or else. So there's a lot of reasons to have them, but I think in first marriages of relatively young people with not a whole lot of assets accumulated before the marriage, I think a prenup really disturbs the generosity and the joint venture and the give and take of a marital relationship.
Well, and if we step back just a little bit about prenups, when you go to get married, you get married in whatever state you determine, right? Or you go elope. When you get married, it's a legal construct, but there's not a lot of discussion about the financial issues. And I think traditionally what a prenup has been there for was to protect, and kind of talk about the financial issues, because when you go to divorce, you're bound by the state of wherever you're getting divorced, of how you split your assets. So I think from my perspective, the financial aspect is really an interesting piece of the prenup that I think as a preventative measure would be a good idea, but you kind of have a different perspective on that.
I do. I do think that having discussions about finances might be good before marriage. Although I think it can discourage marriage, and maybe it shouldn't. Like if somebody has a lot of student loans and somebody doesn't, and most prenups say the student loans are that person's problem, is that really fair when the other person had their education paid for by their parents and the other person paid for their own? So there can be a lot of distortions in the discussion. The other thing is, I think state law has been developed because for generations, because the people developing them, which are courts and legislatures, think what they've developed is fair. So the template prenup that's in every state, which is slightly different in different states, is actually not an enemy, but it's a good thing. And people certainly need to know that, when they're doing a prenup, because they have to know how they're changing that. But sometimes when you change things, it can screw off things. Like if you take a boilerplate paragraph out of a contract, you can totally screw up the contract, not knowing that you've done it. And then you said it's for protecting assets. And that's kind of a red letter word for me, because protecting means, there's other kind of words you could use: hoarding, demanding that it's your own, not sharing. And, if you're getting married, my conception of marriage is that it's, especially first marriages, that to make it work, there needs to be 100% attention to the marriage. And if one person is hoarding their separate property or doing work and keeping all the profits separate, that's going to have a really bad effect on a marriage, because the other spouse will know that, and it will be awful for both spouses. So I just think that prenups have to be handled with great care and only used when necessary.
Well, and some of the reasons that you provided initially for a prenup, and I think that those were very valid, is when you enter the marriage with some sort of assets. And so you already have something, either you have, you're getting married later, or you have something, you could have kids, even, and not significant assets, but, children that are outside of the marriage. How would I even go about, like thinking about this prenup, going about considering whether I should get one if I do have these assets or kids in place? And is there a process that you would recommend, because there are valid reasons that you enunciate in the book that are really powerful for a prenup. And maybe you could help us, that process. It's not just
and
you do it on your own.
There's also valid reasons for not having a prenup.
Correct.
And one of my pet peeves, I guess you'd call it, is that the media is really reaching out to millennials and saying you must have a prenup before you get married. And I think that's wrong. And I think it's a dangerous message to give people. But the problem with prenups is that when you talk it over, when the fiancés talk it over together, it can become really awful and heated and not really productive. And people don't want to step on each other's toes. And, there's all this kind of emotional stuff and money stuff. So to me, the best way to start the process is to talk to a neutral mediator. And the thing about talking to lawyers or mediators is that people are driven by their own experiences. So if you were mediating a prenup and I was mediating a prenup, we'd probably have a very different outlooks, because I'm less pro prenup than you are. You're more pro prenup. And lawyers the same way. If they look at a lawyer, lots of lawyers think a prenup should be very strict and have all the bells and whistles of protecting property, and not letting each other have access to the property, maybe even protecting current income. Earned income. And some attorneys are in long marriages or have been, some aren't, some had awful divorces. So and anybody is kind of driven by their own, any professional, whether it's a mediator or a lawyer, is driven by their own personal experiences. But I do think having discussions with a neutral person that knows a lot about finances, which in the context of mediation, or it could be a marital therapist, who's good at this, or both. And some of my clients do both, is a very good way to start. Much, much better than starting with lawyers, because what I've seen is the lawyer will go full-blown prenup, the off-the-shelf one, send it to the one spouse, they give it to the other spouse, and it's a blow-up.
Yeah.
And that's not good.
Well, and I think that, some of the things that you also talked about is that wealthy families are kind of, and I think that's where I've seen the majority of the prenups is in estate planning or wealth management, where you have wealth that is transferring through the generations that kind of require some sort of prenup. So those are the typical areas that we've seen them, right? And now some in gray divorces as well.
Yes, right. I just like to go back to the wealth people, because
Yeah.
most wealthy parents have trusts, and the trusts are very protective. So, the question is it really needed when they can actually do these protective discretionary trusts with independent trustees, which they do a lot. And then it gets very tender also, because the family, and I've seen this happen, the wealthy family says to their child, you have to have a prenup. And then the two people that are getting married might have been together a really long time. And it not only offends it disturbs the couple that's getting married, but it really can offend the other couple's family, parents. And so it sets a really bad dynamic between the two families. I'm just raising these as things that happen sometime. So it's not true that every wealthy family needs to have a prenup, needs to make their child have a prenup, because they can put things in trust, which has its own drawbacks, because if they put things in a very restrictive trust, which might be a dynasty trust that goes from generation to generation, then it kind of infantilizes their child, who never can really deal with their own money and rise and fall with their own money, make their own mistakes. And the other problem, and another problem about this, is having the burden, especially if it's great wealth, having the burden of wealth, which is a burden for people when it is not earned for the generation that didn't earn it, to go from generations to generations. And that disturbs people that are getting married too. There's one other thing I'd like to say about it that raised by what you said, keeping things in the bloodlines. Well, what about, when somebody, their child has died, and their child's spouse has several children who are their grandchildren? It's really that important to keep money away from that spouse who's raising the children. Even if the spouse gets married again and has more children, it's still important to not support that mother or father of your grandchildren. So, the whole bloodline thing is something that needs to be thought about.
Well, and I think part of this is that, there needs to at least be an awareness that these agreements are being fought in court. And even, I've seen a ton of cases where the estate planning was in place and the trusts were in place to be protective measures, and everybody still goes after the trust or still litigates, to try to, pierce the veil.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, it's interesting as you're talking though. I think that you and I may agree on that. We both think that people have toxic relationships with money, which is what's creating some of this issue of a need for a prenup to protect it, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting what you say about people, attacking trusts. And I've looked at some of the case law. There was a very big case in Massachusetts about that. And I've done more research on it. But, first of all, it's very rare. And because these trusts really are protective, in terms of, having all the bells and whistles. And it might be more pierceable in terms of child support or alimony than the actual trust assets. But then why not? If one party that owes spousal support or child support is very wealthy, why shouldn't the money coming out of the trust be, or some of it, be available for spousal support or child support? And then the cases where that happens are so expensive to mount, and usually it's the less money spouse that has to mount it. They are really rare. Most prenups are enforceable. If you sign it, I tell my clients, my law clients, my mediation clients, if you sign it, don't expect, even if you feel it's not fair on some levels, don't expect to be able to contest it. But I've seen also people at the end of a marriage with a prenup that's kind of restrictive or somewhat not so good for the less moneyed spouse, actually voluntarily giving more. I've done mediations for second marriages where the first marriage the person gave more than what was in the prenup because it was the right thing to do.
I think that everybody believes that the prenup is going to protect them. And a prenup, what I've seen is that even if you didn't have a prenup, you could have a very sophisticated business owner that keeps all of their assets in their own name, that keeps all of the income into a certain place. And the state is going to support that kind of push off of the assets. And so people are thinking that maybe the prenup would protect them in this case, but it does come down to the language of the prenup. It comes down to how it's been put together, the timing, a lot of different factors that go into it. But before we get into some of those, I think
I do have three things to say about what you
okay, good.
One is that when you say that the prenup can protect you, the problem is it can protect you financially, but it can destroy your marriage. So I think when you do prenups, you have to think, as a professional, you have to think about the protection or the fair protection of your mediating for both of them, but also protecting the marriage. So when I'm mediating, I think I have 4 clients. I have the one person getting married, the other person getting married, their marriage, and them together, and the marriage itself. I feel like I have to really look at that to see things that are going to be healthy. Often the prenup ends up being better than what state law says, because here's an example. I've seen this a lot in the work I do. A guy usually makes lots of money by the time he's 55, like millions and millions of dollars in a business, sells his business. He lives in a community property state like California, and he has, all these millions of dollars of premarital property, which is not, he doesn't have to share that with a new spouse. So what do you do about that? You make the law, you change the law for the better for the less moneyed spouse, to make some sort of organized way to give that less moneyed spouse security in case the marriage breaks up, a divorce, and in case he dies first, or the business owner dies first. So lots of times prenups are better than state law, and you just have to think about them in a case by case. I had a situation, there's a situation that where somebody ties up they sell their business, they tie it up in trusts that are so restrictive that they can't share that money with anybody. And it's kind of like they've made themselves unmarriageable, because part of most marriages, except for 2 older people, both of whom have adequate wealth to support themselves without the other, most marriages are kind of a tandem creation of a world of money and children and family and different kinds of efforts. So you can make yourself unmarriageable by certain trusts or having prenups.
Well, and I completely agree. So one of the things is marriage still a construct that makes sense, and or you have a position that says that if you're getting married, like if you're going to marry for love, should the states all change so that they say, well, you got married, everything is split, right? And have no confusion that, like, if you so it's
can you explain that again? I don't quite understand.
Well, if the states said that, okay, once you get married, all the income, all the things, everything that's created is split, and it's consistent around the country, right? We had some consistency.
Yeah.
Then it would be clear that once you entered into this marriage, you're not protecting anything. You can't necessarily have anything be separate, because as the marriage goes on, it's very hard to determine what efforts, what different, like it's not even easy for the court to split up. Okay. And so,
I have an answer for that. And this is true in every state, and probably, I don't know about other countries, but in every state, if somebody stays at home and has children or doesn't have children and creates a home, and the other person who goes to work and makes money, that's considered an equal contribution. because, if they're married and they've been married for a long time, so it worked out for them, it's not, money is not the only contribution, and earning money isn't the only contribution. And so what you're implying is that the value of somebody who makes money is more than somebody who keeps a home, who makes makes the downtime for a person enjoyable, so they both have a good life. I don't see how you can, and that's why in every state, the marital efforts, the results from the marital effort, whether they are money or not, are shared equally. And that's why it's unless there's a very strong countervailing reason, like somebody is a drug addict or a gambler, or did nothing in the marriage, or did nothing.
Well, I could, we decide we're going to get married on Saturday, and today I'm going to start a business, and that business is going to have my name in it. And I'm going to contribute everything into that business that I have, and I'm going to start that business. And over the next 20 years, all that business is my separate property, and all the income that I create is my separate income. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an allowance. I don't want you to just do nothing. And then I'll just do whatever I want with it. And there are a lot of states around the country that are protecting that behavior. So
I don't think there are. Because
I absolutely I'm involved in a ton of litigation cases where,
so they started it with separate property, but they're active. They started with separate property. That's an issue, because maybe that should be returned. And I think there are different results in community property states than equitable states about that. Right. And the community property states might just say that the other person gets reimbursement for the money they put in, or, but not for the time the person put in.
Right. But so let's take the same example. And I now am in a situation of coercive control because I don't have access. I don't even know where any of the money is. And now I have to go fight. There's no prenup, but the person has kept all the money from me. So they say, well, if you get divorced, guess what? You're out on the streets. Take your kid. This is a lot of, I'm just trying to introduce.
Well, that's a good reason to have a prenup in states that do that.
Well, but how do you know? I mean, this is I guess the part is that how do you know when you get married that you should have even talked about these things?
Well, you can always cure that with a postnup.
Well, there you go. Yeah. And you kind of talk about when people are getting married for the first time and have assets that, like, this discussion, even as you and I are kind of talking about it, it's like getting a little, heated about the money.
It's such a terrible result.
I know. So tell me more about how you feel like this conversation is a really difficult one to have at the beginning of a marriage, and absolutely, I'm even encouraging people to look at prenups, in any situation. So, and you're kind of saying that could actually create a situation that you may need that prenup.
Yeah, you may need the prenup, but I think, often you don't, or usually you don't, if people don't have many assets in the beginning. And it now, now that you're getting married and you have all these wonderful feelings, and now you have to see lawyers and, talk about all this stuff. It just seems like not something people want to do when they're getting married. Maybe married for the second time when they got a divorce, yes, but not for the first time. And yes, it can have some bad results, but it can have some good results too.
Because you kind of, and we talked about this, a lot of people when they're getting ready to get married, they maybe seek religious counseling. And you kind of have suggested talk to a mediator about the prenup issue, because you might be able to talk about the issues as opposed to start fighting about things first. Do you want to talk a little bit about?
I've developed a process through my experience. And if at all people can do the first step with mediation without lawyers, it's really good to do that. And then what I do with people is we talk about it. We look at all the finances. We look at all the moving parts. We talk about, they talk about what their feelings are. What if this happens? What if that happens? We try to look ahead. These are people that are young who might be living 50 years or 55 more years. Look at their family backgrounds, all that, see how long they've been together. And, there's all sorts of profiles for people that are more likely to have marriages that are lifelong. And then we start developing a term sheet. And that's really very clarifying. to develop a term sheet. And then the next part of it is that I find them lawyers, because if they use a family's lawyer, that lawyer may have a conflict of interest really between the family. If they use a previous lawyer, that's previous lawyer may not be the best prenup lawyer. If they use a lawyer that was recommended by a friend, it may not be the best. And what I found is that collaborative lawyers, who are usually mediators also, I think they're the best for handling prenups, not business lawyers, not estate planning lawyers, because collaborative lawyers do see what prenups can do to marriages. They do see, what makes marriage thrive and what makes marriage not thrive. And not every collaborative lawyer, if it's not Massachusetts, or if it's not places that I've started to get to know the collaborative bar, I look at websites and I look at the people I read about it, and I try to choose 7 or 8 of them. And then we have a beauty contest in one of our last sessions where we look at all of them, and I ask my mediation clients, to pick their first and second choice. And that usually goes really, really well. And then when they've chosen them, I have a meeting with the 2 attorneys, and I tell them everything I know about the case, everything that was behind all their decisions, and ask them to together, with consulting with their clients, make one prenup draft, decide who's going to go first, which are the attorneys, and have one prenup draft so that it's almost the final draft by the time the clients see it. So there's not 10 drafts, there's not much negotiation. I get called in if I'm needed, usually I'm not. And it's just a very smooth, I might say, loving process that works very well for people.
Well, I think that for people who don't understand, collaborative divorce is kind of a process that's, between mediation and a little bit more organized, but a lot of the same constructs. And I think one of the things that, that makes a lot of sense from that perspective is that they are always looking at win-win and mutually beneficial kind of agreements. And, if we talk about some of the clauses or things that should be included that could be mutually beneficial, which is the intent of these, is everybody that are doing prenups concerned about finances, or is it about other issues?
Well, the alternative dispute resolution provision that I encourage people and put in usually it's in the term sheet, or in the prenup if I draft it, is really helpful for people, because what it does, it says you're going to go to a pecking order of mediation, collaborative law, collaborative process, which usually involves each of you have an attorney. There's a bunch of meetings. Usually there's a mental health professional to keep everybody in line, including the lawyers. And and your lawyers also give you advice and advocate for you offline. And so that's a good step, second step. And then finish with binding arbitration and not going to court. Now, having said that, when you have kids, binding arbitration is never a possibility, because the court will always have jurisdiction over children, over custody and child support, because you can't contract away the rights of children in a prenup. It's a policy decision by the state. But that keeps people out of court and makes it, and also it applies if somebody dies to the trustees, executors, heirs of the person that died and the surviving spouse, because it's binding on your successors. So that's a really, that helps people feel really good about, and some prenups could just have that in it if they wanted to, be limited to that.
I mean, that's kind of, in my opinion, a showstopper. That's a really big thing, because you're preventing everybody from going to litigation, expensive route, right? That's where we're going to fight. That's where you're going to have to bring people like me in and fight every single dollar and how you deal with it. The other area that I think you did describe some benefit, which is a more recent issue, is in also gray divorces.
Yeah.
And so that's where we are protecting not only assets, but we're actually protecting maybe assets that are geared towards the children of, our prior marriages, or maybe doing something to take care of them in the absence, and we're really kind of protecting our kids as well in that situation. Um, and even I would say that some of the prenups and the gray divorces are even more open because you're kind of having maybe these conversations with
Mhm.
these grown children to say,
Yeah.
we're protecting things, but
Mhm.
maybe it's not your your business. I
Yeah,
don't
I
know.
don't think they
Yeah.
should. I don't think the parents should be very specific, just to say we're doing a prenup. I love you. I want to give you money. And so don't worry, whatever, because that can happen sometimes. Somebody gets married again, and their new spouse is their sole heir, and the new spouse's children from the previous marriage gets it. And having a prenup in second marriage is also is very good for creating peace in the extended families between the children. And but sometimes people in gray marriages have to support each other also. And there's all sorts of estate planning techniques where they can let people stay in houses for their life, like Q-tip trusts, credit shelter trusts, and having some assets go to the kids after that parent dies, and some assets come later. And then there's the estate tax issues, because a less moneyed spouse has a lot to offer in terms of providing estate tax exclusion, which is now like over $13 million, right?
Hmm.
Because if one spouse is not the moneyed spouse and the other spouse is, that exclusion, which is worth like $6 million or whatever, 5 million, is benefiting the whole family unit, including the children from the previous marriages.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that a lot of what we're seeing is that either there has been a prenup in place and it's been pretty good at determining what happens up to a certain extent, 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years post marriage. And then we're seeing after that time period what happens, right? And I think that some clients have been interested in, you know, putting together postnups because maybe they're at a point, 5, 10, 20 years into a marriage, things change. You want to
mhm.
pivot and maybe you have a different arrangement going forward. Sometimes there's infidelity. And so there needs to be like a reset point. But there's a lot of good reasons for a post-nup agreement. But maybe you
Mhm.
could tell us,
Yeah,
just a little bit of the difference, even because I don't think most
yeah.
people have heard about this.
Well, there are different rules in different states. In some states, such as Massachusetts, a postnuptial agreement has slightly different standards, because there's a element of coerciveness that can happen in a postnup. There's lots of literature all over about that, not just in Massachusetts, because somebody could say, okay, I want a postnup, I want to keep this and that asset, or else I'm going to divorce you, something like that. And so really I'm not going to suggest cases, but there's a wonderful Massachusetts case that came out in 2010 about that. It's called um, Craven versus Anson Craven, ANSINCRAVEN. And it's long, it's a Supreme Judicial Court case, which is the highest court. And it's really a primer on postnuptial agreements. And it talks about all the things that can happen with it. And when, so in some states, it has to be, most states allow it now, almost all states. But in some states, it can be just like a prenuptial agreement. In some states, prenuptial agreements, you can do anything almost in a
Mhm.
prenuptial agreement. In some states, there has to be a sense of fairness. And so the states, the enforceability standards in prenuptial agreements are different in states, and they are in postnuptial agreements. But the thing about postnuptial agreements is that it really can be a very tender and more difficult negotiation to make sure it's fair and equitable. Like, for instance, let's say that the marriage didn't do too well in terms of money for reasons, maybe there was some downturns, maybe through no fault of their own. The breadwinner spiraled down and got jobs that were couldn't make less money. And that happened with a couple of the last downturns. And then the wife has an inheritance, and it's a 30-year marriage. The wife is going to want a prenup to protect the inheritance, but is that really, is that going to be really fair? And so these are not cut and dry cases to analyze, and they're very tender. And again, doing that with mediation is a really good step to try to figure out what will make people feel good, feel protected, both people, and not left out in the cold, and the dynamics around the postnup. And also, they are very rare. Usually the postnups I have in my practice, the ones that I see mostly are nowadays are people that got into prenups that really destroyed them. After a year, they start realizing how awful it was, or after 10 years, it festered, 20 years. Those are the postnups that I do mostly.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because it seems like a lot of times when I see these prenups, they almost predict the time period of which they're going to get divorced. It's almost like they've created this threshold that,
Yeah.
okay, we've made it that amount of time. Now we know how to split everything up, and okay, let's split it up. And how do you, because the purpose I would think of a prenup or a postnup is to make it so that you're not using things against each other. You're not using those
Right.
threatening things of like,
Mm-hmm.
I'll take the house if you don't do
Yeah.
this, right?
Yeah.
It's people, I think in the olden days thought that it was more like you would determine like when you would sleep together or when you would do
Mhm.
these, like you would do the physical labor and I would do the
Mhm.
house labor. But that's
Yeah.
not really what those are about at this point. They're
Yeah.
more to maybe prevent
They're
bigger.
supposed to. They're
Yeah.
supposed to prevent divorce, but they can also, cause divorce, and that's the problem. And with the postnups, and that's why, prenups didn't become enforceable until about 1970. They were absolutely unenforceable because they thought it was really against the ideal of marriage. And postnups started becoming enforceable much later than that, like really 20 years or so. And some states held out and wouldn't allow them because of policy reasons about how the potential for abusive negotiations or whatever. But they are supposed to help a marriage preserve. They're not supposed to be divorce agreements.
Right. But I think that a lot of times, especially with high net worth individuals, they are used as kind of like, you know, leverage or manipulation. But it begs a question, if we have all these agreements for marriage and such, is it worth it? Do you see marriage going away, or do you see it, evolving? And is this patriarchal construct, how we're going to continue on? So
Yeah.
it's just a little.
I do believe in marriage, and I do think that these agreements, for marriage, prenuptial agreements are sometimes really appropriate. And I think when they're appropriate, they're the ones that help marriage become better. Because they can help in many ways make a marriage better. And I think being married is different from not being married. I really believe in marriage, which is why I'm so motivated when I do prenups, to make them with good process and good content that I think will be healthy for people.
Well, and I think tell us a little bit more about maybe about you and how you ended up authoring the Generous Prenup, and what you're doing to kind of champion, because you've really been, a leader in this space, and maybe can tell us a little bit more about what you have been doing in this field of mediation as well.
I became a lawyer. I went to law school when I was 38 because I'm in the old enough generation. So when I graduated college, I literally did not know what a lawyer did. And women were either nurses, teachers, secretaries, or got married right away. So I decided to be a teacher. And when I eventually went to law school, I loved tax. I became a tax lawyer. And then I started working as a tax lawyer, and then I started doing everything. And very surprisingly to me, I found that I like to do divorce law a lot. And I was doing a lot of estate planning. So my practice a few years ago, I'm just doing prenups. But before then, it was a combination of estate planning. My clients were dying, so I would do probates. and divorces, usually mostly mediated or collaborative divorce. And then I started using mediation maybe 25 years ago to help people. People started coming to me, couples with marital problems, and I started asking me to help them as a mediator. And I started to do that. I started to get more prenup work as a lawyer, and the kinds of dynamics were awful that I was seeing. And so I wrote an article, I think it was, I don't know, 15 years ago. It was called What I Hate About Prenuptial Agreements. And it was just around the time where the internet wasn't so full, and it kind of went viral. And so I started getting more prenup work and more and more and more. And then all the things I was learning was, how badly they were handled. And so I got very motivated to write this book, which took 3 years. I wrote it from 2015 to 2018 and working full time on it because I've been so motivated to make it better for people. And I'm actually in the process right now of writing an abridged version of the book and also an audiobook on the same topic. So I'm still I feel really good about working with people that are looking at this issue and trying to work it out. And from a mediator's point of view, every case is so different. It's so challenging. And there's so many creative solutions that can be done in prenups when you don't just look at the boilerplate prenup. So I find it fascinating. And and as long as I can still work and I can still, do the work well, and I still like doing it, I'm really enjoying doing it and helping people in this way.
Well, and I think that, some of your suggestions, even in the language of, having a way, it's sort of like this is the agreement for your operation of your marriage,
Yeah.
right? Your business of marriage,
Yeah.
and you're determining some of the rules and regulations, but you're at least if you're saying, hey, if this does end, we're not going to go down that path.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think at a minimum, if you can put some of that language in or have an agreement to do that, I
Mhm.
think that could be well worth, even considering this or, looking at your book and seeing if there could be good suggestions. And I think the suggestion of going to a mediator for the work on the prenup is absolutely because another thing that you might also see is that people are going to mediators for issues inside the divorce that maybe, like a lot of times are communication issues or financial issues that just require kind of that referee mediator.
Mhm.
And people are using that sometimes even in place of therapists. So we're
Mhm.
seeing mediators
Yeah.
really kind of help couples, especially sometimes kid issues as well,
Yeah.
are hard to, and even when
Yeah.
they're still married, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, that's what I was doing marital mediation, but I kind of like to call it facilitation
There you go.
because, it's you're really facilitating conversations between people where those conversations can get very hot.
Yes.
And what I like to call it is it's a financial plan for your marriage, not a prenup. Prenup's a bad word, but a financial plan for your marriage. That's
Well, and I think that level setting the education and the knowledge is also beneficial, right? So it's not really to leverage on the other person or manipulate. It's to
Mhm.
be transparent about where you see the future. And I
Yes.
think if you can get to that position where you're just, hey, I see it as blue and you see it as
Mhm.
purple, and that's close enough and we can do this,
Right.
or it's
Yeah.
completely different and it's not going to work. So
Yeah.
any other tips or suggestions you have for people
Um,
as they go through this process?
beware of prenups that don't have a inheritance provision, because a lot of it's very traditional for attorneys not to have an inheritance position. You'll make your own estate plan, which you should do. But if it doesn't have an inheritance position, people can change their will the day before they die. And in a prenup, you've disclaimed all the rights that would let you modify that in a court
Mhm.
action. So that's not a good one. The other thing I do that really helps people is that if there's irrevocable parent trust involves, we put them on share screen and we look through them because people really don't understand what's in them. And understanding what's in them and how the money might come out in the future is really, really important for people to see, to actually understand that. Because you can't just say that If you're the beneficiary of a irrevocable trust set up by your parents or grandparents, you can't just say, well, that's off the table, because it's something that needs to be dealt with. It's a reality. Money will be coming out of that. What do you do about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the more you have discussions about it, the better. And understand that the courts don't care about the word fair for the most part. And so you'll have to fight it in court if that's how you're going to go about it. So I appreciate all of your information. And
Thank you for having me on the show.
yes, and we will give a listing of how to get your book and more details about how to contact you. And we hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you.